What did he think of the Negro leaders, Martin Luther King, for example? Did he ever mention?
Well, I don't know what he, well, I do know what he thought of him later. Well, he said what an incredible speaker he was during that Freedom March thing, and, you know, when he acknowledged that having made that call during the campaign got them. Then he told me of a tape that the FBI had of Martin Luther King when he was here for the Freedom March. And he said this with no bitterness or anything. How he was calling up all these girls and arranging for a party of men and women. I mean, sort of an orgy in the hotel and everything.
Martin Luther King?
Oh, yeah. And at first he said, oh, well, you know, and I said, oh, but Jack, that's so terrible. I mean, that man is, you know, such a phony then. No, this wasn't, this was when there was just one girl. They had the conversation. Jack said, oh, well, you know, he would never judge anyone in any sort of way. Oh, well, you know. He never really said anything against Martin Luther King. Since then, Bobby's told me of the tapes of these orgies they have, and how Martin Luther King made fun of Jack's funeral.
Oh, no.
And made fun of Cardinal Cushing and said that he was drunk at it. And things about they almost dropped the coffin. Well, I mean, the Martin Luther King is really a tricky person, but I wouldn't know. He never said anything against Martin Luther King to me. So, I don't know if Bobby would be the one to find out what he ever really thought of in that way. But Bobby told me later, I just can't see a picture of Martin Luther King without thinking, you know, that man's terrible. I know at the time of the Freedom March, when they all came in his office, well, he was always, I think he was touched by Philip Randolph.
Philip Randolph was very impressive. He's an older man and has great dignity.
Yeah. And all that, and he was very worried about that Freedom March. Turned out all right, I guess.
Worried that it might lead to violence?
Well, yes, everyone was worried, weren't they? And, but, you know, civil rights just, well, that was just something that was always there, wasn't it?
Now, as I said before, she recorded this knowing that no one would hear it until 50 years later. So you got to understand that. Now, when you really listen to everything, I mean, she went in on everybody. She talked shit about Lyndon Baines Johnson. I mean, everybody who she didn't like, she went in. I listened to the whole 8 hours. So when you really pay attention and listen to what she was saying, she went in because she knew nobody was going to hear it until she was dead. You know, they would have been dead too by the time, you know, it got released. But she went in. She didn't pull no punches, and she went in. So it's definitely credible, and we know the tapes exist because Coretta Scott King spoke to the tapes herself, and you can get them in the year 2027. But this all goes back to my point I was saying. If the government did not want King to succeed, if they didn't want everybody to integrate, then they would have just discredited King. The FBI was sitting on the tapes for years, and they still sitting on them, but they choose not to release these tapes. One, they built Dr. King a big giant statue down in Washington, D.C. because he helped them out. He was their guy. He was their guy that helped them get the whole civil rights movement passed. We got a Dr. Martin Luther King Day to remember his birthday and everything. You got off, people don't got to go to work, all that because Dr. King helped their agenda. So what was the real purpose of integration? What was the real reason why they wanted blacks and whites to come together? Not just in the school system, but everywhere. They wanted blacks to come into white stores. You got to really think about that. Because when you start to look at what makes a government flourish, what makes a government thrive, it's the people, and it's the taxes that the people pay to the government to run the country. So if you don't have enough people having good jobs and paying taxes and giving taxes to the government to run the country, it's going to cause a recession. It's going to be a problem in the economy. Now, 1964, the whole Civil Rights Act was passed. That same year, Ronald Reagan gave this speech endorsing Barry Goldwater, and this is what he was saying about the economy. Listen.
I have spent most of my life as a Democrat. I recently have seen fit to follow another course. I believe that the issues confronting us cross party lines. Now, one side in this campaign has been telling us that the issues of this election are the maintenance of peace and prosperity. The line has been used, we've never had it so good. But I have an uncomfortable feeling that this prosperity isn't something on which we can base our hopes for the future. No nation in history has ever survived a tax burden that reached a third of its national income. Today, 37 cents out of every dollar earned in this country is the tax collector's share. And yet our government continues to spend $17 million a day more than the government takes in. We haven't balanced our budget 28 out of the last 34 years. We've raised our debt limit 3 times in the last 12 months. And now our national debt is 1.5 times bigger than all the combined debts of all the nations of the world. We have $15 billion in gold in our treasury. We don't own an ounce. Foreign dollar claims are $27.3 billion. And we've just had announced that the dollar of 1939 will now purchase 45 cents in its total value. As for the peace that we would preserve, I wonder who among us would like to approach the wife or mother whose husband or son has died in South Vietnam and ask them if they think this is a peace that should be maintained indefinitely. Do they mean peace, or do they mean we just want to be left in peace? There can be no real peace while one American is dying someplace in the world for the rest of us. We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose that war, and in so doing lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening. Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the Founding Fathers. Not too long ago, 2 friends of mine were talking to a Cuban refugee, a businessman who had escaped from Castro. And in the midst of his story, one of my friends turned to the other and said, "We don't know how lucky we are." And the Cuban stopped and said, "How lucky you are. I had some place to escape to." And in that sentence, he told us the entire story. If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government, or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves. You and I are told increasingly we have to choose between a left or right. Well, I'd like to suggest there is no such thing as a left or right. There's only an up or down. Man's old age dream, the ultimate in individual freedom consistent with law and order, or down to the ant heap of totalitarianism. And regardless of their sincerity, their humanitarian motives, those who would trade our freedom for security have embarked on this downward course.
So Ronald Reagan is saying the American economy is not doing well. We are still feeling the effects of the Depression. We are still going through the bankruptcy of 1933. So America is not doing well. You got white people losing jobs. You got not enough jobs being created to help those white people. Meanwhile, the black community is flourishing. Black people are doing well. And we're not even integrated with white people yet. So it's like the whole 60s, we were on a rise and they were on a decline. So what happened? How did that come about? Now, you have to go back to what happened, what I was saying earlier about the slaves being freed. Once the slaves became free, of course, black people became citizens. It wasn't until 1935 that everybody became United States citizens. That is a fact. Up until 35, only black people was United States citizens legally. Now, in 1935, the Social Security Act got passed, and everybody had to be born with a birth certificate and had to get a Social Security card. But out of the Social Security Act, what was in that act was the welfare program. So now you got the black community doing well because they can't go nowhere else and spend money. So all the money's staying right in the black community. But also you got some poor black people getting welfare, and that's tax money paying for that welfare. So they had to integrate, because once you integrate, that's going to create a bigger government. That's going to create more jobs for white people. That's going to create more tax dollars for the government to run the country. Now, some of you might think that there's nothing wrong with that. That, what's the problem with that? What's wrong with black people paying more taxes and helping the economy out? But the whole thing was we were being used. We were their remedy, but we was not given a remedy ourselves. And what I mean by that is this. Now, when you have this whole Civil Rights Act passed and you have the whole integration going on, it's going to create more jobs for white people. More jobs, because the problem was, since so many white people was on welfare during the 60s, since so many white people was losing their jobs, the government's answer to all this was to create more jobs. But how do we create more jobs? How do we get more tax dollars? You have to integrate, because that's going to create more jobs, because now you got all these black kids going to these white schools. It's going to create more teaching jobs. It's going to create more programs in that school system, and that's going to create more jobs for white people. All of those businesses, all of those small shops and restaurants that black people couldn't get into, now we can get into. Now that's going to create more jobs for white people coming in, because you got to serve these black people. That's going to create a lot more jobs. But meanwhile, it's going to destroy the black community. And that's exactly what it did. It's going to destroy black businesses. It's also going to draw a lot of black people into white communities to get jobs. Now, you might think that's a good thing. Hey, black people getting jobs. But how is it a good thing if that money is not going back into the black community? It's now going into the white community. Because now you had that black restaurant owner or that black shop owner. He can't afford to pay that black worker the same amount that these white people is going to pay. So now his business goes under. So you can see what I mean when I say they had a remedy and there was no remedy given to black people for the decline that we was going to face with the whole civil rights movement, with the whole integration. So it destroyed black businesses. White people was on the rise and we fell. And a lot of people didn't realize that. And, some people saw it, like Malcolm X and other black scholars, seeing that this is what's going to happen with the whole integration thing, and they wasn't for it. So when I say to you that this was a plan, the whole Civil Rights Act was planned, because you have to understand that these was laws. Segregation, ride on the back of the bus, these were state laws. This wasn't a bus company enforcing this. This wasn't like, shop owners enforcing this. This was a state law. So it could have been very easily overturned a long time ago. They had to change that law. It wasn't just like a stipulation. It was a law. So in order for you to change this law, you had to have some kind of movement. You got to really sell it to black people. And Dr. King is the one who they chose to sell it. And black people, unfortunately, back then didn't realize what they were being sold. So now, when you look at all of the companies that went out of business, when you look at all of the black people who lost their jobs and they were now forced onto welfare, and they couldn't really go out and find a job because the black community was basically destroyed business-wise, and they couldn't really go into so many white communities and get jobs. A lot of them wasn't qualified for a lot of the jobs, so a lot of them was forced onto welfare. Now, it wasn't, of course, as easy for black people to just, come out of welfare because they couldn't get a job. But what the Civil Rights Act did, what the whole movement did, was it just created so many jobs for them to come out of welfare. And as I said, that same remedy wasn't given to us. So now, basically, the government is paying black people to fail. That's what the welfare system is. It's paying you to be unsuccessful, paying you to be down. We make excuses for it, but that's basically what it is. So, of course, later on, you had the whole affirmative action thing being passed because they really needed to get black people in higher positions. They needed us to really get jobs because you need black people to control other black people. It's just that simple. We're not going to go and deal with so much if we don't have that black face there, telling us that it's okay. Now, a lot of us, we get happy when we see black professors, when we see, black scientists and black politicians, and we think, that's us. We doing something, yeah. But really, it's black people who are serving the agenda of white people to control black people. It's just that simple. So when you think about a whole school system, you think about a black teacher, he's not teaching what he want to teach. He has to follow a curriculum. He has to follow what the Board of Education tells him to put out. So he's not really helping his people. He's hindering them because he's teaching them exactly what the enemy wants them to learn. So to sum up this whole civil rights movement, the whole purpose of the movement was to create more jobs for white people. You've seen Ronald Reagan touching on the fact that the economy was not doing well the same year that the Civil Rights Act was passed. That was the whole purpose of it, to create more jobs for white people, meanwhile destroying the black community. Because when you have a black community that's united, when you have a black community that's starting to figure it out and they are starting to get well at business, you're going to create Black Wall Street, because the dollar was staying within the black community. It was not leaving. It was rarely leaving. So you're going to create Black Wall Street, and we've seen how successful Black Wall Street was. But as I've been showing you in this video so far, whenever we gain any momentum, whenever we start doing well, they destroy it, they break it up. And the Civil Rights Act was a whole nother movement that was geared at breaking up the unity of black people. And they teach us this in school, and they tell us that, it was a good thing, and it was just Dr. King fighting for rights and all this. And also all well and good until you examine it. Once you examine the whole movement, you see the true purpose of it. So, I'm not trying to, rag on Dr. King and say he was a bad guy, this or that. He probably, like I said, he probably really thought he was doing something good in the beginning. Dr. King thought he was just helping his people. But you have to understand, they really needed somebody to sell the civil rights movement. They needed somebody to sell the whole idea of black people integrating with white people. They needed somebody to really push it. And that was the purpose of Dr. King. Because no white politician can come into the black community. No white politician can come on TV and say, hey, black people, we need y'all to start bringing y'all kids to our schools. Or we need y'all to start coming into all these restaurants and shops we said y'all can't come into and give us y'all money because we need the tax dollars. We need to create more jobs for our white people. They couldn't do that. We would not have followed that. So they needed somebody to really sell the whole movement. And Dr. King sold it well. He sold it really well. Dr. King convinced black people to lead a whole non-violent movement, to allow themselves to be beaten up and have dogs sicked on them and have cops beat them up. He convinced black people to allow all these things to happen to them and not do anything. He convinced them that the way forward was to integrate, was to be with these white people, was to the whole, little white boys and little white girls holding hands and all this and that. He convinced them, he sold it well, beautifully, and it all sounds well and good. It all sounds good until you examine it. As I've said, I think the best way that we should have done integration, we should not have forced it, of course. We should have let it occur naturally. It's just what should have happened. We had it forced upon us and we wasn't ready. But they needed it to happen then. It fit their agenda. And that was the purpose of Dr. King, to sell their agenda to the black community. And he sold it. And of course, they made a martyr out of him when they killed him, because now it was like, okay, black people was like, okay, we're going to continue Dr. King's dream. Let's advance the dream. So let's go ahead and go forward with it, even more so that they killed our leader. And that really just sealed it, because we didn't know what was going on. We didn't examine it. So that wraps up the whole civil rights movement right there. So Dr. King was assassinated. A few months later, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. And so many people were dying in the Vietnam War. So you had, for the first time, white people starting to see that something is not right with their government. Something is going on here. Something is wrong. So more than ever before in America, you saw more of a unity between black and white. We had so many black actors around that time that was coming up, that was preaching, black power, and trying to show the government, for what they really are. You had so many black athletes that was doing well. We had black people on TV. We had a lot of black TV shows. Black people on radio stations during the 70s. Black people on magazines during the 70s. Black people still was doing good once integration happened, as we have always done. When we are united, we flourish. And we were still good in the 70s. And the 70s saw, more than ever before, a lot of interracial marriages, a lot of interracial couples, because white people were starting to see that, what we have been told about these black people cannot possibly be true. They was getting to know black people, and things were going very well between the races in the 70s. So of course, they had to put an end to all of that. Okay, so this is where it all starts to really go downhill. Now, mid-70s, late 70s, integration was not that long ago. We're talking a little over a decade ago. And we have to remember all of the poor people that was already in those black neighborhoods. We got to think about now, around this time, a lot of those black businesses are failing. They are going under. And a lot of black people, older black people, they're too old to go out and find jobs. They're too old to go back to school. You know, it's a lot of poor people coming out of those neighborhoods. And it's a lot of, you know, the whole desegregation thing is spawning new poor black people. So out of the whole Social Security Act of 1935, you had welfare. You know, out of welfare, you had the housing program, public housing, you had HUD and all those things. So now, instead of them taking these poor black people, you know, helping them find a job, educating them, you know, helping them out, you know, taking them to the side and building them a home, putting them in a nice house, what they did was they built these large apartment structures. We know them as projects. They built these tall buildings and just crammed as many poor black people as they can fit into these things. Now, the problem with that is this. They took these buildings and they built them in neighborhoods where you had black people who was trying to make a difference, who was trying to do something with their life. You had black people they was not rich, they wasn't even middle class, but they had enough money to afford a home or to pay rent on a home or a mortgage. So they was doing okay. So you had black people who are on the cusp of middle class, you know, trying to do something with their life. And then you have the government come and build these projects, these housing units, right in those neighborhoods of black people. So I don't care what else is going on. When you have a community full of poor people, crime is inevitable. It's going to happen. It's inescapable. There's going to be crime when you have a community of poor people, because a human's instinct is to protect itself and to survive. So you're going to survive the best way you know how. Okay, so now you're probably thinking, why would they put all these black people together if they don't want us to unite? You know, what is the point of that? And see, the whole problem is before integration, we were united. We were together in a community and we all had a common enemy. We had an enemy that said, you can't shop here, you can't eat here, you can't sit here, you can't even shit here. So we had an oppressor who was forcing us to stay united. And we were united, of course, against that oppression. We was united against white people. And our whole goal, our whole atmosphere was, you know, black power. Let's be successful, let's rise up, let's stick together, let's stay united. And then all of a sudden that changed. All of a sudden they said, okay, you can come in. Okay, you can eat here. You can sit here. You can use this restroom. So now it's like, that's over with. So what is my function now as a black person? Of course, before it was always success and to be successful. But now it's some new doors they have opened up for me. It's new situations that I can go explore as a person. So what is my goal? What do I want to do? Because now the enemy is gone. The enemy is saying, you can come here. So now you control the climate. They control the climate. Now they put black people in an area that they control. They put them in houses that they built. They put them in situations that they control, and they can change that climate and control that climate. And this is what happened. Because you got to look at the problem. You got to look at what was the problem for these white people, for the government. What was happening? You had these successful black people, these educated black men and women going out into the world and making a name, doing big things, and then coming back and bringing it back into the black community. They had to stop that. They had to make it so that these people did not come back to this black community. They had to make it so that they came back to a white community, so they came back to the open arms of a white system, and they did not teach or educate these black people. So you have to create a situation to force these black people to not do that, to make these black people not want to come back and educate their people. And that was one of the major purposes of desegregation. Because it basically went from straight in your face, I don't like you, to talking behind your back. It went from you trying to go into a white restaurant, they saying, no, nigga, you can't eat here, to sure, come on and sit down. Give me your money that's going to hurt that other black business that you are not giving your money to. Little do you know. So this is what it was. It was a subtlety. It was a change of attack. That's all that happened. So, two major problems that they had to solve. One, keeping educated, successful black people from coming back into the black community. They had to fix that. And two, they had to change the image of black people because we were starting to be looked on too favorably amongst white people. They had to change that image. They had to change it so they can stop all this whole, interracial marriage. They can create conflict. So what do you do? And this is the generation, late 70s, early 80s, that most of us was born into. This is the generation, myself, 1982, I was born. This is the generation that we all know, that we know about. So what came about in this generation, and we all know it was the drugs. The drugs was one of the biggest plans that was hatched. It was one of the main things that contributed to the situation that we are in today as a black community. And it was their dagger. So now when you take a step back, when you really start to look at it and analyze what has taken place, you start to realize exactly what the black community is. The black community is now the new slave quarters. And all the successful black people who are convinced not to come back and help these black people out, all the people who became cops, who became welfare caseworkers, who became lawyers, who became even teachers, these are the new house Negroes, the new house niggas. And their job is to work for a system that is further enslaving our people. Because think about it. What was going on in slavery? We was working for the white man. And now once integration happened and desegregation happened, and all these white people say, hey, you can come work here now. Guess what we was doing? We was working for white people again, because they destroyed all the black businesses. They're gone now. Black business is over. The black unity has been compromised. They got in, they infiltrated, and they separated us. So now we went from black power unity to me, 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 me. And then things are about to get worse because now they have to really, for all times, destroy the image of black people. And it's the image that is still a lasting image that's going on still today. And that was the whole crack epidemic of the late 70s, early 80s, and so on. Now, we already know, if you research this whole situation, we know that the CIA, they were the ones who brought the crack into the black community. Now, I want you to take a look at some video that's going into this whole thing. We all know about Freeway Rick Ross and about, the whole situation with him, but take a look at some of the evidence that is supporting my case. Take a look. Okay.
It's about a drug ring that operated in San Francisco and Los Angeles in the mid '80s, and it was connected to a Nicaraguan anti-communist army called the FDN, which was one of the biggest groups that we know as the Contras. And it was selling cocaine in Los Angeles for the most part, but in other areas of the country as well, to the gangs, to the Crips and Bloods down in South Central Los Angeles. And they were taking the money and using some of it, I don't know how much, we haven't figured that out yet, to buy weapons for the Contras. And I know it sounds crazy. I know it sounds like the wildest conspiracy theories, which is why all our supporting documentation for the thing is posted on the internet. And if anybody's interested, I can give you the internet address a little later on.
Yeah, we've got from the Mercury News here, a big chart that you put together from the Sunday story. Did you write all this, by the way?
Yes, I did.
This is a chart that shows how the money left down around Colombia. And can you give us a little bit of this scenario on how these plans?
I'm not looking at a television right now, but is that the pipeline chart?
It is.
Yeah. Those were the various smuggling routes that the ring used starting in the late 70s up to the early 90s to get the cocaine into the country and to get some of the money back out of the country. And it depending on the year and depending on the how intense the police scrutiny was, which wasn't very for the most part. Those are the different routes they used. They used freighters. They used stolen cars. Wow. They would just fly the stuff in suitcases early on when you didn't bring very much in.
Let me read the first one up here, which is right near Los Angeles. It says, mid-1970s, luxury cars stolen in California were driven to Nicaragua, where they were officially imported by the Nicaraguan military to avoid stiff excise taxes and sold to wealthy Managuans.
Right.
The second number, which is way down here in Peru, it says mid-late 1970s, Peruvian cocaine was smuggled to Panama, secreted in suitcases and shoes with false bottoms and carried into the U.S. by airline passengers. Points of entry included San Francisco, Los Angeles, Houston, and New Orleans. The third one is late 1970s to 83. Cocaine from the new Cali cartel in Colombia was loaded onto freighters owned by the Gran Colombian Line. The freighters were offloaded in the ports of Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. 4. Early 1980s, cocaine was flown from Colombia to the Bahamas, where it was loaded aboard small planes and flown into Miami. From there, couriers would take it to California aboard commercial airliners.
Right.
Now, I can go on about this, but where did you get the new information?
You know, it's been public record for 20 years almost. It was just from court files. I mean, eventually, once in a while, they would catch one of these people. The DEA would file an affidavit and lay out what they knew about the drug ring's operations, and it came from, a lot of stuff in National Archives mostly, a lot of these old court cases. And then there were cases in Nicaragua which laid out the smuggling routes through that country into the United States, so we had the back end of it as well.
Gary Webb, Jack Nelson is at the table. I do want to tell the audience something, because right over your head, you can't see that. Look up on that screen there when we have it. It looks like there's a crack in the window, but that's actually condensation on our window back here because it's so muggy, and it comes right down Jack's head, so I wanted to let
Yeah, you wouldn't believe how muggy it can get here in Washington.
Oh, yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Jack Nelson asked a question.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you, because I haven't read the series. It looks fantastic, but what about the CIA involvement in all of this? Is that...
Well, that part of the story deals with the FDN, the guerrilla army that I mentioned earlier.
Right.
That was, as the Iran-Contra hearings documented pretty well, that was a creation of the CIA.
Right.
And we tracked the cocaine dealers who were running this operation all the way up the ladder to the couple of CIA agents that were actually running the FDN, Enrique Bermudez and Adolfo Calero. And let me tell you, as a bit of background, most of this information, or much of the information, came out at a trial in San Diego in March. One of the cocaine brokers, a guy named Danilo Blandon, who was the head of the Southern California operation, has been working for the U.S. government for the last couple of years. And he was the star witness in a cocaine trafficking trial for the DEA in San Diego, and a lot of this stuff came out under cross-examination when he was up on the witness stand, because the defense was curious, to say the least, about his relationship with the Contras and the Crips, and unfortunately they couldn't really get into a lot of it, because before the trial the United States filed a motion asking that nobody be allowed to ask Mr. Blandon about his relationship with the CIA, and it was one of the most curious documents I'd ever seen. It said, if true, this matter would be classified, and if false, it shouldn't be allowed at the trial. So,
did you get any?
Really got a chance to quiz him in great detail about his relationship there.
Did you get any help at all out of the CIA?
During the investigation? Absolutely not. They wouldn't even return my phone calls. I mean, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request for information on Blandon and his boss, Norun Meneses, and I was told that they can't tell me anything because it's a matter of national security.
Gary Webb, where are you from originally?
My dad was in the Marines, so I'm from everywhere.
And how long have you been with the San Jose Mercury News?
I've been with the Mercury 8 years. I was with the Cleveland Plain Dealer 5 years before that.
Where'd you go to college?
I went to college in Indiana for a year, and then I went to college in Kentucky.
We're at Indiana University?
Yeah, IU in Indianapolis, at community college, and I had a scholarship there, and then my dad got transferred, and I ended up at Northern Kentucky University.
We're going to take a call in a moment, but in your stories also, you say that the Crips and the Bloods, the gangs in L.A. get involved in this. How?
That's the back end of the deal. That's who was buying the cocaine, and they were buying cocaine and they were buying weapons from these fellows.
How much? Can you give us some sense of how big this thing is?
Well, one of the guys that talked to me was the guy who was buying it, a fellow named Freeway Rick Ross. He was the biggest crack wholesaler in Los Angeles during the 1980s. And he says, well, he and Danilo Blandon have both said that, at their peak they were doing 100 kilos a week. And that's just with one dealer. I don't know how much Blandon was selling to other people, but with Rick Ross, he was selling at least 100 kilos a week by 1984, 1985.
It was a monumental historic event. I mean, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency was coming to Watts to face the people. Now, we all know that the U.S. government and the CIA supported the Contras in their efforts to overthrow the Sandinista government in Nicaragua in the middle 80s. Now, it is alleged that the CIA also helped the Contras raise money for arms by introducing crack cocaine into California.
Deutsch felt he had to do something to try to deal with the outrage that was foaming all over the country at the time. And of course, it just blew up in his face.
CIA fights drugs. CIA does not encourage drugs.
Well, I mean, it was actually one of the most monumental blunders of all time, if you think about it.
We have no evidence of a conspiracy by the CIA to engage in encouraging drug traffickers in Nicaragua or elsewhere in Latin America.
Deutsch was there because of the Gary Webb stories. The Gary Webb stories had sparked a national furor.
I would like to have Richard Ross's brother to speak, please.
The United States government turned their head and let this cocaine come into the United States of America.